Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to count your rows in your knitting. So, counting rows is a skill that is especially important if you're going to do pretty much anything beyond a very beginner level pattern. And this is because, it's always going to be important to know how many rows you've already knit. And it can also be extremely helpful in determining where you are in your pattern if you have a stitch pattern that has multiple rows in it. So for example, if I have a stitch pattern with a 4-row repeat, then I need to know, if I lay my knitting down and then pick it back up later, I need to be able to know which row I just did so I know which row to do next so it doesn't throw off my pattern. So I have several different swatches of different very simple knitting stitches, and I'm going to show you how we count rows in each of these types of situations. So first let's look at the stockinette stitch, and this is the one with a knit side and a purl side. So here's the knit side and here is the purl side. And if you haven't watched my video yet on how to count your stitches, then you're going to need to go and watch that first, because what I explained in that video is kind of essential to being able to count your rows, because you need to know how to identify those stitches in the first place to know, where your rows are and how many you have. So first let's look at the knit side, and if you remember from the first video, which was part 1 of how to read your knitting about counting your stitches, we identified what one stitch looks like in the fabric. So here's the knit side of the work, and let's pick this stitch right here. So one stitch is where this strand of yarn comes up on one side, goes behind these two strands back here, and then comes back down the other side. So that right there is one loop of yarn, and that is one stitch. But it looks like a V shape. It looks like it's two separate strands that make up a V shape, even though it's actually all one loop of yarn that starts here, comes around this way, and comes back to the bottom. So we know that each V shape is one stitch, and you do want to keep in mind that when you turn this upside down, it looks exactly the same. One V shape equals one stitch, and it does look exactly the same when it's turned upside down. But generally, if you have needles in your work, and if you can tell the difference between your cast on and your bind off, then you will be able to look at this and know that it goes this way. So up here at the top is my bind off, down here is my cast on, and we're going to be looking at individual V shapes like this. So when we are counting rows, we are counting basically columns of stitches. So if we look at this, we can see that all those V shapes kind of nest together in columns. And the columns are how one stitch goes up through the fabric, but that shows us how many rows we have, because we can count how many stitches are in the column and know how many rows we have total. So if I start here at the bottom, here's my cast on edge, and right here are the bumps, the horizontal bumps of my cast on. I used a long tail cast on for this, so I'm not going to be counting that horizontal bump, but we're going to count all of the V shapes that go above that in this one column. So here is one side of the column, and here is the other side. So we have basically a column of V-shaped stitches, and we can see each of those V shapes as they are stacked together. So not counting this horizontal bump, we're going to count V shapes only. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then up here we have 11, which is the one that hides under the bind off, and that is the bind off row. But if you are working with the stitches while they're still on the needle, then you won't have that. You will only have the finished rows that sit below the needle. And the row that is currently on the needle with the loops around the needle, that one does not count as a row that's already done. So if I start at the bottom again and count, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 rows. That would be if I did not bind off here. But before the bind off row, I have 10 rows, which is this one to this one. Now, if you want to, you can just count the one side of the V shape strand, and that will also give you the same number if you're just counting rows. So I could just count one side of the strand and say, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and it would do the same thing. But you just want to know that when you're counting those diagonal strands, that one diagonal strand is not a stitch by itself. It takes both sides of the V shape to equal one stitch. So we learned how to count stitches across the row in the previous video about counting stitches. And we also learned to identify a knit versus a purl. So here is the knit side. And on the knit side of the work, we count V shapes. But on the purl side of the work, it looks totally different. So if you remember how we described the purl-shaped stitches on the wrong side or on whichever side has purl stitches, go back and check the previous video if you haven't seen that yet. We can look and see that some of these horizontal strands curve kind of downward like a rainbow, and then some of them curve upward like a bowl. Okay, so the bowl-shaped stitches, the bowl-shaped strands, I should say, the ones that curve downward or up, I guess upward like this, like a bowl, or like a smiley face, those are not stitches, okay? Those are the strands of yarn where the stitch is here, and then that yarn has to pass across to go to the next stitch, and then it comes across and goes into the next stitch. And so this strand, this smiley face or bowl-shaped strand, does not count as a stitch because it is not a stitch. It is just where the yarn, travels across to the next stitch. But the actual stitches are these rainbow-shaped strands that kind of curve downward. And those are the ones that we count as actual stitches. So if I were to count across a row, I would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. But when we are counting rows, we also have to keep in mind that even though they're harder to see here, there are still columns of stitches that we can count to get our rows. Now if I stretch this far enough, you can see how the purl rows kind of separate into little squiggly rows right here. So we have the rainbow-shaped strand with the smiley face or bowl-shaped strand, and then the rainbow one, and then the smiley face. And we can see how that right there is one row. It takes both the rainbow-shaped strands and the bowl-shaped strands to make one row. And up here again, here is another row. And if we pull this apart far enough and stretch it far enough, you can kind of see how that we still have columns of stitches. We are just looking at the other side of them. So in this case, if we're counting rows on the purl side, we're only going to be counting from one column, and we're only going to be counting those rainbow-shaped strands. Those are the purl bumps. So I'm going to start at the bottom. And you want to make sure that you are following the column of stitches correctly. You don't want to be like going at it the wrong angle and ending up over here because you're not going to get the correct count for that. So I'm going to pick this column right here. So here is one purl bump or rainbow-shaped strand. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I went ahead and stuck my my extra needle in there so you can see how that is a column, but normally you would just kind of point them out to yourself and say, okay, here's 1, 2, 3, and etc. But this is how our rows are going to appear on the purl side of a stockinette fabric. So we still have columns of stitches, but we're just looking at the other side of them. And if I flip this over, you can see how that those purl bumps, if I take one of these right here, this is a purl bump, and on the other side of it, if I pull on it, is a V shape. So we can see how the front of the loop right here is our knit stitch, but the back, or the section of yarn that passes behind the two strands above, so if we're looking at this stitch right here, it goes up one side, it passes behind the two strands above and comes back down. So the part of it that passes behind the two strands above becomes the purl bump. So this right here is the back of the knit stitch, and you can see if we stretch this, here are the legs, or the V-shaped strands of the knit stitch from the purl side, but you can only really see it in this case if they're stretched. So now let's move on to the garter stitch swatch. And garter stitch can be a little trickier to count rows in because they all look like purl rows, but they're not. With garter stitch, we are knitting every single row, and so we are ending up with garter ridges, and we can kind of put these next to each other and see how they're different. So if we look at the purl side of the stockinette, we can see how this is like a solid, all squished together section of purl bumps and then the little strands that travel between the stitches. Whereas on the garter stitch one, we have ridges. So we have distinct gaps or ridges in between these rows, and that is because on the other side of each ridge is another row of bumps. So we are kind of basically making a zigzag here. If we were looking at it this way, we're making a zigzag because we are alternating between having the row of bumps show up on this side, and then it shows up on this side, and then it shows up on this side, and then it shows up on this side. So both sides of this stitch are identical, and to know how to count rows in garter stitch, you need to know how to count rows in both purls with the stockinette, the purl side, and the knit side of the work. Because we have what appears on one side of the work as, it appears as garter stitch, but it's actually going to show up as some knit stitches and some purl stitches, even though they were all knit. Because when we knit from this side, it shows up as what would look like a purl stitch on this side. So we're going to start down here at the bottom, and we're going to follow a column of stitches. So you can see right here, here is a V shape, that is one stitch, and then we have a stitch here that goes up and around and comes back down, but it has a purl bump. So we're not going to count this V, this little V that's hidden underneath these strands as a stitch, because it's not. So we have one V shape, one purl bump, that's two. Then we have another V shape that comes out of the top of the purl. I'm going to stretch this so you can see it. So you can see the difference here between the ones that look like purls and the ones that look like knits. The ones that look like knits, the yarn at the top of the loop, if you can see that, it goes behind the stitch above it. So if we follow this one, it goes up, behind, and comes back down. So that's a knit. And then this one shows up as a purl because it comes up and then goes under these two side strands, the ones that travel across. You can see the top of the bump up here, that's all one loop, and then it comes back down. So we're going to start at the bottom again. I'm not going to count the bump that's from my cast on, but I have one knit stitch, one purl stitch, because we have that whole loop that makes the purl bump, so that's two. And then here's a knit row right here, that is three. And then this next one is a purl row, because you can see the top of the loop makes that purl bump, so that's four. Knit stitch, that's five. What appears as a purl stitch with the bump at the top, that's six. Here's another knit stitch with a V shape, seven. And then here's another one with a bump on top, that's eight. Here's another knit stitch, that's nine. And then here's another one with the bump on top, that's 10. and then here's another knit stitch, that's 11, another one with a bump, that's 12, and then here's another knit stitch, that's 13, and then another one with a bump on the top, and that one is 14. So I have 14 rows in this swatch, and this one, like I said, can be slightly trickier to count if you're not familiar with the stockinette stitch, how it's structured and how to count rows in that. So that's why I showed you that one first. But this one can also be counted by how many ridges you have. So if you have complete ridges, each ridge is 2 rows. So I could say, if I were looking at it from this side, which is technically the correct side to do it, I have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 rows. And then this up here is my bind off. So we can count it either by spreading it open and looking at the actual rows individually, or we can look at it as the ridges and count ridges only. And each ridge is 2 rows. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. So now let's look at this one over here that's still on my needles. And this swatch is done in moss stitch. So moss stitch is kind of like alternating ribbing. So we have 2 rows that we repeat, and for the first row, we knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1 all the way across. And then we do that again, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1 all the way across. Then we purl 1, knit 1 all the way across for 2 rows. So if I were to set this down, let's say I needed to count how many rows I have. Let's pick this column right here. So if I start at the bottom, I have a purl row, a second purl row. If you see these 2 little bumps right here, that's 1 purl row, 2 purl rows, 1 knit row, 2 knit rows, that's 4. Then the next one up has a bump on it. That one is 5, but that's a purl. Here's another purl, that's 6. And then here's a V shape, 7. Another V shape, we have 8. And then another purl bump, that's 9. And another purl bump, that's 10. So we alternate, so we're kind of making a little checkerboard of 2 rows of purls here, and here, and here, and here. And the same with the knit stitches, they are kind of in a checkerboard fashion. And again, if I were to start at the bottom of this column right here, I would start with the knit stitches because that's what's facing me first. So here's 2 rows of knit, and then 2 rows of purl, 2 rows of knit, 2 rows of purl, 2 rows of knit. So let's say that I were to forget which row I was on. I'm going to knit a little bit of this here for you. And so right now I can look at what's sitting up against the needle, and like we identified in the previous video, these ones that sit up against the needle with a V shape are knit stitches, and the ones that have a purl bump against the needle are purl stitches. So I can look at this and say, okay, I've already done this knit 1, purl 1 row twice because I have 2 knit rows right on top of each other with 2 purl rows on top of each other in the next column. So I can know, okay, well now I need to work the purl 1, knit 1 row because I'm only supposed to do the knit 1, purl 1 row 2 times. So I've already done it 2 times, and now I'm going to do the purl 1, knit 1 row. So every time I see this purl stitch, I know I've already done the 2 rows that have a purl stitch on top of each other. So I'm going to knit those and then purl the ones that show up as knit stitches. So that is the row that I just did. Now let's say I left it like this and then I came back to it later. First of all, you want to make sure you're looking at it from the right side when you go to determine which row is next, and this stitch is reversible. So when I say the right side, I'm talking about the side that you're supposed to work next. So we can see, okay, if I were to work this, I would hold this needle in my left hand. The working yarn is coming from this side, so I would hold this in my left hand, and this side of the work would be facing me. So now I can look at this again and say, okay, I've got knit stitches and purl stitches sitting up against the needle. So I have one knit stitch up against the needle and one purl stitch, but I don't have two purl stitches below the needle and two knit stitches like we did before. So down here, if I cover this up, we had two purl stitches and two knit stitches. Up here, up against the needle, we only have one of each. So now I know I need to do that same row again, where we match the previous one, and I will purl the purl stitches and knit the knit stitches to make sure that my stitch pattern comes out correctly. And you can see as I knit across, now I have two of the knit stitches and two of the purl stitches. So I know that I am on the right row for this stitch pattern. So here is what my swatch looks like at this point, and you can see that even though we were kind of pretending that I laid it down and then picked it back up later, I can still see that my stitch pattern continues on seamlessly without any kind of breaks in it or mistakes in it, because I can see, okay, well, this is the row that I need to do next. Now, knowing how to identify knits and purls only in your rows is going to be helpful to you, but for more complicated patterns, you will also need to know how to identify other kinds of stitches in your work to tell which row you're on if you're using a stitch pattern that has other kinds of stitches in it. But for now, for this video, now you know how to count your rows in knit and purl textures. And of course, it will be slightly different depending on what your stitch pattern says and how many knit stitches, how many purl stitches, and how many rows of each one. But in this particular case, you can see how that we can adapt to different stitch patterns just by knowing what the pattern says to do and being able to look at the fabric and say, okay, well, we already did this, so now I know what I'm supposed to do next. So I hope this video has been helpful to you. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know if you've ever had trouble counting your rows in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.